Let me talk to, before we get to Israel, Gaza, which is obviously the biggest news story in the world at the moment, let me just talk to you about this issue of immigration in the UK. Another big plan announced by the UK government, by another Home Secretary. I think it's the fifth we've had. It was the third Home Secretary to go to Rwanda since they vowed to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. And so far, no asylum seekers have gone to Rwanda. But there's also a wider problem here, not just of legal migration, illegal migration, but also legal migration. And it's affecting the whole continent of Europe and indeed wider parts of the world. What's your assessment of how we should deal with this new world of millions of people wanting to move to, in their eyes, a better place?
Well, we do indeed, Piers, live in an age of mass migration, though it's not the first in history. If you look at the flows relative to population, they were comparably huge in the late 19th century. I'm myself an immigrant. I'm an immigrant to the United States. You might say I also was an immigrant to England from Scotland once upon a time. And I'm married to an asylum seeker. My wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, sought asylum in the Netherlands. And so we as a family are hardly likely to be hardline opponents of immigration. That would be immense hypocrisy. I think there are a couple of really important points that are worth making here. The first is that if there's a sudden swing in net migration, if you suddenly go from relatively little to a lot, to hundreds of thousands in the case of a country like the UK, you would expect there to be some kind of public backlash. And if anything, to me, the surprising thing about the UK today is that the public's been so tolerant of an extraordinary surge in net migration, which is certainly not, I think, what people expected to be one of the consequences of voting for Brexit. The interesting thing is that if you look at opinion polling, there's no real evidence of racism, of xenophobia. When British people complain about excessively large net migration, they're just complaining about the impact on public services, the kind of services like the NHS that come under strain when there are suddenly hundreds of thousands more people to serve. So I think one lesson of recent years is that one mustn't allow there to be such big shifts, because while immigration is, I think, a necessary part of the way the world works, especially a world of aging populations in many developed countries, it's important to recognize that people shouldn't expect it to come in great surges. The second point is that I think you need to have a clear and coherent policy that the public understands. And I think at the moment in Britain, there's the very opposite. There's really considerable confusion. And I must say the swings in policy, as you mentioned, the regular changes in policy, the somewhat outlandish notion that people whose asylum cases are questioned will be sent to Rwanda, none of this has inspired public confidence, rather the opposite. And one must wonder why the Prime Minister would sack a Home Secretary who'd called for more restrictions and then just within a matter of days introduce new restrictions of the sort that I think Suella Braverman had called for. So this is calculated to confuse and disorient the public. As I said, the impressive thing to me is that the British public's remarkably tolerant. I sometimes read in the New York Times that Brexit was motivated by imperial nostalgia or Little Englandism. Turns out to be quite untrue. One of the least predicted consequences of Brexit was that migration into the UK shifted from being plumbers from Poland to being people from outside the European Union, from as far afield as Hong Kong and other parts of Asia, as well as North Africa. And British people are remarkably tolerant of this. In fact, in many ways, I think they even welcome it when it helps keep the NHS working. So the key issue in Britain, I think, is that there are public services under strain, especially in the southeast. Housing, of course, is a huge problem even without immigration in the southeast. And to me, the only surprising thing is that people aren't more indignant about this. Look at the Netherlands, to make one final point. In many European countries, this issue is causing earthquakes in the political landscape. New parties surging into positions of power. in Germany, the Alternative for Germany. And what happens in Britain? Well, nothing much really happens because it's still a two-party system. And the arguments go on within the Conservative Party and within the Labour Party almost exactly as they did when we were kids, Piers, back in the 1960s and 70s.
Mm. And, you know, it's one of the reasons I've been so incensed about this whole Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Oprah Winfrey racism row, is that it painted this country as a hotbed of white supremacists and racists right from the very top with our royal family, when in fact, all the evidence points to the complete contrary, that we are arguably one of the most tolerant countries in the world.
I agree with that, Piers. And in fact, if you look at the data, survey data and data on behaviour, I think you could make a very convincing case that the United Kingdom is the most tolerant country in the world. And I always like to explain to Americans, you know, the thing about the English is that they really care a lot more about class than they do about race. I say this semi-jokingly. Actually, if you look at the data, Piers, it's very striking how much wider the disparities are in terms of income and quality of life between white and black Americans as compared with their British counterparts. And I would say one of the most striking features of our lifetimes has been Britain's transformation from an overwhelmingly white society into one that, particularly in the South, but not only in the South, also in the Midlands, is really extraordinarily ethnically and religiously diverse. And one might have said, as Enoch Powell, of course, did in the late 1960s, this will lead to terrible trouble. There'll be blood in the streets or in the River Tiber, as he said in his famous speech. And that hasn't been the case. Enoch Powell was actually wrong. Britain's accepted this very enormous change in its social aspect with remarkably little friction, in my view.